Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's been a great conference. This paper will have perhaps a little more theory. It's both empirics and theory, but it has a little more theory than some of the papers before. So the idea is to look at the media industry, which is different from other industries because of externalities. There are many externalities. One of the externalities is the externality on the democratic process, meaning that the media provides information for the process, and this information could potentially be manipulated. It's very easy to find very chilling quotes. There is also evidence that this manipulation, that this influence exists in various forms and in various locations. If you believe that this influence may exist, then you can ask the question, what should society do to protect itself? This begs the question of media regulation. Now, we have evidence that, for instance, the lovely paper by Macmillan and Zoido, that in situations where the media sector is poorly regulated, you can end up with large-scale capture. And this can be very bad for society. So what form of regulation can you have? Regulation of content is increasingly difficult because of First Amendment protection, which are now more and more common in all countries. So we are left with regulation of ownership. And so this is mainly the type of things we will be talking about. And there's evidence at high level of concentrations in many countries. The US is a big exception. And that higher concentration levels lead to are correlated to worse political outcomes. This is very much of a regulatory question right now. Both the FCC in the US and Ofcom in the UK have recently published white papers on this topic. The existing regulation takes two forms. There is some form of regulation which is on its way out, which is platform specific. Newspapers have to follow certain rules. Network televisions have to follow certain rules, so on and so forth. That's on its way out because there's a proliferation of platforms, and the same content can appear on multiple platforms. Your New York Times, you read it on paper, and you can get it on your Kindle or whatever. So what remains is standard competition policy. This is a very consistent set of principles to protect mainly consumer welfare. Protecting consumer welfare means in particular controlling, making sure, looking at what happens to prices, quantities, and quality. Now here, and this is a point that Ofcom makes, for instance, this is missing the externality, right? Because the externality does not go through prices, quantities, or other consumer welfare-related variables. The externality goes through the political process and through voting. So this makes, and this is a point that the regulatory literature has made, this makes assessing media mergers very difficult. In the sense that often, from a standard competition policy, they do not pose any particular concerns, but most of us are concerned because of the democratic process. So a research question which I do not address, but I try to think about is can we think of some way of measuring the potential influence of a media organization on politics? And this way, can we think of something that's related? So can we microfound it in a way that's related to citizen welfare? And can we think of something that's implementable with existing data? If you want to do that, you face at least two challenges. The first challenge is that media operates on multiple platforms. Newspaper, TV, radio, internet increasing, and in the future we probably expect an additional other platforms that we cannot even imagine right now. Now these platforms are, as a good approximation, separate markets, in the sense that if the price of a newspaper increases, it's not like people are going to buy more cable subscriptions. there is also a big problem in the sense that some of these platforms, so the externality we're interested in operates through news, does not operate through other forms of communication. So if you think about television, the majority of what television offers is not news-related. The vast majority is something else. So if we look at television as a platform, only a tiny percentage of it is related to the externality we're interested in. So the question that we can ask is, how do we aggregate influence across the various platforms? And this is a problem, in my view, that existing attempts to measuring this face, because they're platform-centric. So the most developed measure is the FCC's Media Diversity Index, which was struck down by the courts. And this index operates by looking at individual platforms like newspapers, radio, so on and so forth, and seeing the market share within that platform and sort of summing it up across platforms. So, so if we have this challenge in mind, one possible solution is that the right moment, the right level of aggregation is not the market, it's not the platform, but it's for what we want to do is the mind of the voter. So for what we want to do, we want really to think about, Julia, what media does Julia uses, and then Julia is a voter, and so we want to see the media sources that Julia uses, how can they affect her voting decisions. We can define this in some sense, and then we aggregate across the population, we integrate across the population, and this will lead to a measure of influence that is consistent for what we want to do. So the second challenge is, in my view, much harder. And it's, okay, now we know that if we can answer the question, what affects Julia, we have an index that makes sense. But that's the hard question. It's a very hard question because it's about something that hasn't happened. It's about something that could possibly be out of equilibrium. And it depends on a ton of questions. So it could depend on, how naive you are in the way you interpret the media. It depends on how many items you process of the sources that you receive. It depends on whether you're able to cross-check. You can come up with a lot of reasons why this effect may depend on you. And it also depends on the media. So maybe the media do not want to influence you. Maybe they just want you to know the truth, in which case we don't have a problem. Maybe instead they're partisan. Maybe they care enough about profits that they're not willing to risk their reputation. So you can tell a lot of stories there. The empirical media economics literature has made enormous progress, and many of the people in this room have contributed to it. However, I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of latitude within the literature, and you would expect so. You would expect that the level of influence depends on many parameters, many specifications. So we have different estimates of the level of influence. We have different estimates of how biased the media are and the motivations of the media. We have also estimates on naivety, how naive are consumers. Given this heterogeneity, I think that it's difficult to come up with a model, because one solution would be to come up with a model of how Julia would behave, would respond. I think such a model is difficult to have right now, because it would be difficult for it to capture everything we've observed. However, it's also true that any form of regulation will depend on what we assume on voter behavior. So the solution that I'm trying to propose here is that instead of looking at one model, we look at a set of models, and we look at the lower bound and the upper bound on influence. So that's what I'm going to try to explore this. This is not going to be, this is the opposite of assumption-free. We kind of state our assumptions by saying what this set of models is, and we look at the upper bound and the lower bound, and of course this is full of assumptions. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do two things. I'm going to do a theoretical part, and there's going to be a calibration empirical part. In the theoretical part, I'm going to take a set of possible models, and they will span various levels of naivety, and they will span various levels of information processing ability. And I will be inspired by a recent literature on robust design, which kind of takes the idea that what a regulator does should be based on a set of possible models, and they should look at the extreme outcomes that come out of that. And the result of that will be an index of media power, which will be a bound index. And then this index can be estimated with US data. So the index will be based on media consumption. We'll take as an input media consumption patterns, and it will be possible to estimate this index for all the main US media organizations. This approach is then refined by saying, okay, one way we can refine these bounds is by look at specific estimates that we have, and these are estimates for a particular media source, media form, at a particular, in a particular set of times, and we can say, what would the media power index look like if we think that that is the worst that can happen? And so it's again, it's a bounds approach, but it's based on calibration. And so I'll do this with a number of leading estimates of media influence. So the results is sort of, there's a methodological result, which is, I'm not married to these assumptions, but I hope I can offer a way to map assumptions into a media power index. And the second one, and this is something this is a reaction I will get when I look at the data. Under a vast range of assumptions, there are some common patterns here on media power, and I will try to share them with you. So let me dive, if there are questions, let me dive into the model. The model is extremely simple, and I will talk about its limits later on. So there's two. So what does the model include? The model is a very simple political economy competition model, and then the media will play a role. There are two candidates, A and B. The relative quality of candidate B is sigma, which is uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. There is a mass of voters. For now, they all have the same preferences. They want to elect the better candidate, and in particular, the candidate A offers a utility of 1/2, and candidate B offers a utility sigma. So they want to elect B if and only if sigma is greater or equal than 1/2. So if they knew the truth, they would all vote for B if sigma is greater or equal than 1/2. However, they do not know the truth. There is a media sector out there, and there is a set M of media sources. Voters differ in the subset of media that they utilize. So, and we can, without loss of generality, divide voters into subsets according to the subset of media that they utilize. So Steve reads the New York Times and watches CNN. He's part of a segment of people who exactly read the New York Times and watch CNN. We can define the attention share of an outlet. So the attention share the attention that Steve devotes to CNN is 1/2. You can do better than that. If you have data on attention, you could say that Steve devotes 65%. I don't have the data, so I won't put it in my model, but you could do it if you had that data. So I'm going to say that Steve devotes 50% of his attention to the New York Times. If I integrate across all people, I can obtain the share of attention that the New York Times gets in the population. And it will be something that will come out later. So this is an example of a media consumption matrix. There are 10 segments in this population. Each of them has a 10% share of the population. And segment 1 only watches television channel 1. Segment 2 is the same, I don't know why. Segment 3 watches television 1 and reads newspaper 1, so on and so forth. And you can compute the reach, which is a standard measure of media penetration. And you can compute our measure, which is attention share. Let's first assume that the media is completely unbiased. So let's assume that they report the truth. They report what they observe. And what can they potentially observe? Given candidate quality sigma, each media outlet observes a strings of news stories. And each news story is a number, either 0 or 1. If it's 1, it's favorable to candidate B. If it's 0, it's favorable to candidate A. And the probability that a story is favorable to candidate B is equal to sigma, is equal to the quality. So in a sense, the quality is what produces these good events. Make my life easy. Let me assume that I will assume that all variables here are IID across news items and outlets. And so if news outlets are unbiased, they will report the string of signals. My voters are boundedly, have cognition limits, so they only observe or remember a limited number of items that they're exposed to. So Steve reads the New York Times and watches CNN, but he has a certain bandwidth. The bandwidth is K, and this means that he will remember K items out of all the items that he reads or that he is exposed to. Km depends on the segment. So if you have segments where you have various bandwidth, you can just split them up. And again, I'm going to do a lot of IID assumption here. And I'm going to make an assumption which is, and I'll defend it later, which is that you do not observe the number of items you're exposed to. You only, so that prevents you from trying to guess whether you've been manipulated by looking at the number of items that you've been exposed to. This is, again, always in the spirit of finding this upper bound. So we're still the media unbiased. How would you vote if you are in this world? So you, Steve, receive K binary signals, 0, 1s. And it's pretty easy. Well, you're good at econometrics, so you will just vote. You know they're unbiased. You will vote for B if and only if the majority of signals are in favor of B. Now, you may make a mistake, right? You may make a mistake because you might have been unlucky and received the wrong time signal, but society as a whole will make the right decision. And this is represented in this picture. So this is the this is sigma. This is the quality of candidate B. And this is the share of votes that candidate B gets under the assumption that K is equal to 5. So for instance, if sigma is equal to 60%, then more people would vote for B than for A. Some people will make a mistake, right? There's going to be people there who are going to get 3 signals in favor of A, and they're going to vote in favor of A. But the majority will always vote in favor of B with a law of large. I'm assuming that here we're going to. I'm looking at asymptotic results. So what happens if k is greater? So here is a word where people remember 5 items. If they remember 20 items, this becomes steeper. There are less people who make mistakes. And the two extreme cases are k equal 1 and k equal infinity. K equal infinity, no one makes mistakes. K equal 1, it's the highest case. If there are people who have k equals 0, you can just throw them out because they don't get information in this world. Okay, now let's have fun, and let's assume that the media may be biased. And I'm going to proceed as follows. I'm going to assume that a set G of the media is potentially controlled by a potentially biased owner. I'm going to assume that all the other media outlets are completely unbiased. Why do I make this assumption? Not because it's a reasonable one, but because I'm looking, again, I'm looking for a worst case situation. And so suppose that if the other media outlets were biased in the opposite direction, then it would be good to actually, it might not be so bad to have a bias in the opposite direction. If they were biased in the same direction, then they should just be part of G. Again, asymptotically, so, and I'm going asymptotic also on the number of items so that I don't have integer problems. And so basically now a policy of, and I'm interested in the policy of this evil owner. And the policy of the evil owner is a mapping between sigma, the true quality of the candidate, and the proportion S of items in favor of B that he actually reports. So he censors items. He cannot fabricate items, but he can report selectively, and he has full leeway in how he does that. So this is the evil owner. Now let's talk about what I'm trying to do here in terms of upper bound. The lower bound of this model is 0. You can make a series of assumptions here that will guarantee that there is no influence. Like I can assume that Julia immediately understands if someone is trying to manipulate her and just shifts away, or I can assume that all owners are great people and they just want to transmit information. So the lower bound is certainly 0. I have nothing interesting to say on the lower bound. We're going to look at the upper bound, and so we're going to make all the assumptions that are going to make influence as high as possible. The first one is that the owner of this subset of media G just has only political objectives. Doesn't care about profit, doesn't care about reputation, just wants to get A elected now in this election. Doesn't care about the problem that then he might getting A elected in the future might be harder. You have about 20 minutes. Okay. Now, voters assign a belief beta to the event that the owner is evil. And for the rest, they're Bayesian voters, so they will update in a Bayesian way. The voter chooses this strategy, and again, I'm going to assume that to look at the worst case scenario, that Julia doesn't switch and goes to other media, so on and so forth. I'm gonna go pretty quickly here in order to get to the empirical part as well. So what's going on? There is a set of models, and the set of models are K, which depend on K, the number of items that you can process, which for now we hold constant, and your naivety. Now, you receive all these items. We're focusing on a specific voter. The specific voter receives all these items, which can come from the potentially biased media or the unbiased media, and they can be positive or negative. Given your beta, given your naivety assumption, you can simply update in a Bayesian way. You can update in a Bayesian way, and you can compute the expected value of sigma given the signals that you observe. Now, if you wanted to solve this as a game, it would be very hard because you would have to ask yourself how should the owner choose the optimal strategy. The optimal strategy may not be 0 items in favor of A, and you can, this is very hard because there are a lot of media sources, so we're not gonna try to do this. We're gonna try and look at the bound of this, and the bound of this is achieved when? Let's look at the lowest posterior that you could have, and simply mathematically you can find that this is bounded below by this. It cannot be lower than this. And what does that correspond to? That corresponds to a situation where you're completely naive. That corresponds to a situation where you're completely naive. Given this posterior here, I can compute the share of votes in favor of the two candidates in your particular segment, and that's given by the probability that the expected value of sigma given the signals that you observe is smaller than 1/2. This is not a very nice formula, but it's not very terrible either. It's just, we're exploiting the properties of binomials here. And this, again, corresponds to the limit as beta goes to 0. If you use that, my approach, you would get a picture that's very similar to the previous picture, except that now the intersection for a particular segment. So this is an example where there are 3 outlets, and the evil segment where there are 3 outlets, and the evil owner controls 1. And in that case, the evil owner is able to get a majority of voters to vote for his favorite candidate, even though the quality of the other candidate is higher. And this is actually a 2/3. So you might get your candidate elected even if the other one is 2/3 rather than 1/3 quality. And so that leads very quickly to then a general formula for the power index. The power index of a media group is the ability of that group to get a candidate elected that would not be elected under unbiased information. And the media measure, the index measure is how many votes you can swing. So you can, one easy way of seeing this is just saying that if you can swing, suppose that in the presence of unbiased media, candidate A would get 60%, and you manage to reverse the election, then we say that that's a candidate that's winning with a 20% margin, then we say that your power is 20%. If that's the best you can do. And all I have to do now is just to sum over segments, and I get a formula for this index. Now, this index still depends on K. So you have a version, it varies, it can be, the minimal bandwidth case is the one where every voter just observes 1 item of news, remembers 1 item of news, and then you can be really paranoid. I mean, not as paranoid as you, but quite paranoid. And you can look at the worst case by assuming that K may vary by segment, and by looking at the vectors of K's that maximizes the power of that particular group. You can have a formula here. And all this, the advantage of all this is that it's computable on the basis of the media consumption matrix that I described before. So let me skip, and you can extend this to ideology by just assuming that voters receive signals before all this. And these signals are exogenously given. So you receive some signal that tells you that A is good. That's your ideology. Okay, let me spend the last 9 minutes on empirics. And by empirics is really calibration. I take some data. So what I need is a media consumption matrix, and it comes from the Pew Research Institute. I have the surveys from 2000 to 2012, which asks Americans, 3,000 Americans, where did you get your political information last week? And asks for very specific sources. It improves over time. Basically, 2010, 2012, you have all the major sources, including internet sources, including internet versions of non-internet sources like the New York Times website. I'll skip this. So media ownership, I tried to reconstruct it, and basically I identified 3 conglomerates. One is News Corp, the owners of, and this is in 2012, this is the owners of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. Then Comcast, which owns NBC and MSNBC, and then Time Warner, that owns CNN, Comedy Central, a big source of information, and Time Magazine. Now let's look at the first thing. You remember you have this paranoid worst-case scenario as opposed to the minimal bandwidth. In theory, they could be very different, and I construct examples where there's all kind of reversals. In practice, the 10 largest media organizations in the US have the same ranking in the 2 indices. So because the minimal bandwidth one is much easier to compute, I'm going to use that one. And this is the results for the minimal bandwidth power index. And so the biggest one is News Corporation, then Comcast, and Time Warner. So these 3 conglomerates are the largest. And then they're followed by ABC, NPR. Yahoo is the first non-television source. Then a bunch of them. New York Times is the first press source, and then there's a bunch of other sources there. These numbers are large, right? Because this is 0.2, 20%. It means that News Corporation could swing elections that have a 10% difference. This is simply a reflection of the fact that there are a lot of Americans who just watch one television, get their news only from one television channel. Fox is one of the largest. If you assume that the channel can influence them, you get these numbers. So it's as simple as that. This is the evolution over time. As you would expect, newspapers, this is the power of someone who owned all the newspapers in the US. And as you can see, it goes down over time. You have lots of extensions. So one is the one that Jim asked about in the beginning, which is, what if you look at, you're not interested in federal elections, but you're interested in state elections? You can do the same. The data becomes a bit thin, so I can do it for New York State. And if you look at New York State, as you would expect, the New York Times becomes more powerful. New York is a liberal state, so News Corporation goes down, and Rush Limbaugh disappears. You can do ideology, so your question. So here I've assumed that the voters are homogeneous. You can do, and here you have to put assumptions. So one assumption you can make is that there are 3 types of voters: the Democrats, the Republicans, and the independents. And the assumption is that the Republicans have received an infinite number of signals in favor of Republicans. And so then you just look at the swing voters, which are the independents one. The numbers are quite similar because, for instance, if you think about Fox News, on the left, very few people watch it. On the right, a lot of people watch it. But as it happens, the number of independents who watch Fox is almost half the number of Republicans. So it doesn't change very much for that reason. You can abstention is a big issue. So you can also control for abstention. All this is, if you have assumption. The other thing you can say is, so you can look at you can say how are things going to change? And if you assume that media consumption patterns are not going to, are just determined by your age, then you can say, okay, let's look into the future and let's throw away all the people who are older than 40. So I'm out. And let's see what the media power would look like, and it changes. So now Yahoo becomes a 3rd source. But it's interesting because even with this very dramatic change, the first 2 sources are still television sources. It's okay, 30 seconds about the calibration exercise. You can redo all this with real numbers. What you do in terms of structural exercise, you estimate, these estimates will give you an estimate of the percentage of naive voters in the population. Once you have that estimate, you can apply it across the board, and you can have other figures. As you would expect, the power index goes down a lot, but the relative power is very similar. And you can do various versions. So for instance, then I assume that televisions are different from newspapers. For newspapers, I use your estimate, which is a 0, and then you can look at that as well. Let me conclude with this slide. So I think there are three. When I look at this, I see three patterns. One is that power rankings are very consistent across specifications. The other one is that three conglomerates stand out, and these are televisions. So basically, the main message of this is that under most reasonable assumption, television is the most powerful media source in the US. It still is. And so in regulatory terms, we should be particularly worried about it. Thank you.
So, I have a different thank you to the organizers than everybody else. So, I'm a complete outsider. So I spent a lot of time thinking why they asked me. It's got to be half that I'm a complete outsider, and I might say some things different than other people say. And the other half that probably I've spent more time on the phone to the FCC trying to figure out what they mean. In the course when I was an antitrust enforcer. They have two completely incoherent concepts. I don't mean that they're in principle incoherent. I mean they're incoherent in the sense they articulate them. One of them is we want more diversity of voices, which is not treated in this paper. And the other is we don't want too much power, which they articulate in a completely incoherent way, and that is articulated in this paper. So I like this paper a lot because it took on that very difficult challenge. So could we have a fully thought out model in which the idea of too much media power is operational? It gets operationalized here with a couple of elements. The first one is the definition, and almost all the paper is, could a more concentrated media industry swing a presidential election in the United States by sigma points? How big is sigma? So that operationalizes the idea. So that seems like a really good research idea. There's one other really good research idea in here, which is may actually be useful back to the advertising and commercial advertising side, which is this point, which I articulate slightly differently than Andrea did, but following him, think of a traditional media metric, the reach of a medium. What is that? That's the probability that a given voter sees this medium, right? And you aggregate that. That would be, you would aggregate that across the whole population, across his segments, which are what media do see. Here, think of the power index when k equals 1. This is a case, like for me, just as for Andrea, this is the easiest case to think about. What's the statistic you want to know? People only remember the last message they saw. Take the case k equals 1. What do you want to know? You want the probability that a voter saw this medium most recently. And these will be very different statistics. Reach just depends on the marginal distribution of media watching, whereas this pie depends on the whole distribution of who watches what media. So that seems like a really good idea too. And so those are sort of two animating ideas. There's this goal, and then there's this animating idea. The paper takes on a hard problem. We're trying to define audience statistics that tell us there's too much media concentration quantitatively. So we need a quantitative model of voter response. Paper spends a lot of time on that. We also need a quantitative model of election outcomes, right? So I just did the comparison to reach. That's just an audience statistic. To take an example from my IO world, You know, people always calculated the Herfindahl-Hirschman index as an index of how concentrated industries were. And then came this terrible, terrible day when we learned that there was a single model that would exactly justify that calculation. And I thought, oh man, that must be wrong, right? But here, Andrea gets out of that by looking at this question of robustness within a particular class of media. But he needs to make quantitative assumptions about the voter response and about the rules for election outcomes. Those interact. Very important assumption here, I think, that that we're just trying to assess the quality of a candidate, just quality. Vertical product differentiation here, right? Everybody would agree when the dust settles who the better candidate is. That's an objective fact, not heterogeneous views of and the other thing that's an important element in the election outcomes column is that it's going to get determined by, the outcome's going to get determined by a majority of all voters. So what could you worry about? Oh, let me say about the voter response assumptions. I'm reacting more to the paper than the talk, but I think they both had this in common. The assumptions about the voter response, rational but limited voters, Bayesian updaters, potentially limited in bandwidth, possibly sophisticated or naive, we don't really know, about biased media. I think in a way this is the obvious first class to consider. And there's two reasons for that. The one, I'm going to be a critic for a while. Signals are monotone in this class of models, right? The weekly monotone. If a medium publishes a positive story about a candidate, in this class of models, it can only be good. And you can have other models where Matt suggested one a few minutes ago, but you can have lots of other models where suppose it was issues instead of quality, where you wouldn't get that monotonicity, weak monotonicity. That's a limitation. On the other hand, it gives you comparative statics you might like. How smart are people? How ideological people? Oh, I left out one of the bullets. The other important bullet here is that people might be ideological. What is ideology? Here, ideology is you just got a strong prior signal about a particular candidate or party. That keeps us in the monotone world, but you can do comparative statics in ideology and do comparative statics in how smart people are in two different senses. So that's obviously the first thing to consider. The paper doesn't really say very much about why I did this case first. So let me think. Let me think about what are some of the other cases you might have considered. Let's start in the middle where the paper talks a lot. So this is a rational inattention model. There are a lot of those around. It's a particular one. There are other rational inattention models that are not like this. So part of this is the scope of the robustness is limited to this particular class of rational inattention models. In commercial advertising, there's an enormous amount of attention to emotive rather than rational responses to media. That's usually to advertising. And you might have a somewhat different view of ideology rather than a prior. I replaced emotive with moralizing, again, because we're mostly talking about national elections in the United States. If you thought there were, if you wanted a model of non-rational consumer, boy, I'm such an IO guy, voter, you can see where I spent my life. If you wanted a model of non-rational voter response, it seems you would think about like this, these problems of delivering moralizing messages on both sides, and how do you get people to buy into those, possibly even when it's not an interest. Another thing which is big in the commercial advertising world about the advertising response function, here the voter response function, is competitive interference. And there are a lot of strange phenomena in competitive interference, not always monotone. Advertising by one firm can raise the demand for another firm's products, things like that. And that's, and that would seem to be, maybe that's more have to do with the diversity of views thing. Anyway, The other one, which is, I think, also not here, but potentially very important. I mean, again, use what do our friends who study the advertising response function do? They have lousy dependent variables. But it's also, and so they study, does this person know the name of the product? Does this person know the name of the voter? Does this person think this is a good product? Does this person think this is a good candidate? Does this person intend to buy? Does this person intend to vote? But these are also, I think, analytically interesting categories, not just different dependent variables. Right? Particularly, if you draw a distinction between voters who turn out and voters who don't turn out, moving preference, knowing about, to actually showing up could be a big difference. And similarly, okay, so I'm sorry, so it's limited to up here. I'm sort of building a menu, a complainer's menu, sort of take one from over here, take one from over here, take one from over here. I got 4 of those to complain about. But let me say what's the rest of my menu, right? It's a quality of candidate model. It's not that candidates or parties create aggregates of people with different interests into into winning vote coalitions. So you could get heterogeneous quality assessment where here everything's always monotone. There's no turnout issue, so we don't have an opportunity to think about mobilizing the base. Okay, and then there's lots of other statistics. So I chose 4 things from this menu. The first one I think is, I think the monotonicity tends to somewhat exaggerate media power. What if instead of talking about quality, you had to talk about issues, right? And there might be, and either true or biased reporting on issues might move different people in different directions. So that's one thing. If you suppose that the centrist voters have different responses, responses of a different sign on certain issues than the base, then that's going to sort of, that makes the problem of being successfully biased harder. I'm not, and you might, similarly, with coalitions, it's harder to articulate why something's good if the members of the coalitions are interested in different stuff. Occasionally you get geniuses of that, like somebody figured out how to explain that budget conservatism and social conservatism are the same thing, even though they sort of are non-overlapping interests. But in generally, I would think, if it was issues rather than just quality, the media indexes ought to drop. Second one, we're really reach-like here. Partly that's because of the data. But, we might also be thinking towards it. So the next thing you think about after reach is frequency. This is one where I think the media power indexes are going to maybe go up. It's clear if why do you buy frequency if you're buying ad space? You buy frequency because if you want to create a tighter emotional bound, right? Translate that to a political thing. You're trying to build a bigger moralizing emotional bound, right? So, you might get more people seeing more of the same message and then developing more of an emotional bound. So that's an important difference between moralizing or ideological messages rather than just true or false ones. So here I guessed right. Matt's already asked this one, right? There's this other potential case. By the way, I would not just think about the game between the voters and the media, but what about the game between the two moguls? right? You know, sort of fairly famously, the invention of Fox News created a serious profit opportunity on the other wing. And then that might play out in the game by the voters. But we have, you know, it's not just, we're here interested in what if there's one bad guy. Well, what if there are two bad guys? One of the mergers that's contemplated in the paper is you merge Fox News and MSNBC into the same conglomerate. That turns out to be a very powerful conglomerate. You know, just like suppose the two parties got together and decided who should be president, right? That's a pretty powerful conglomerate too. So there's that one. So here's another one. This is one, I picked this one because robustness will just be completely impossible. You know, suppose there were another opposite sign, right? I'm doing everything I'm doing here by picking the best examples I can where there would be opposite signs across different people. Suppose that, you know, you can win by getting out the base. We're talking about national elections in the United States. Current president was widely said to have done that, rather than by hitting swing voters. Right now, you know, so if both of these are possible, it's clear that you're never going to get any robustness, right? That lots of media power means get out the base. When that's exactly the opposite of lots of. Okay, so that was. So anyway, all of these are all specific gripes. I bring them up more in the spirit of like thinking this was a really good idea, and that we ought to think about what the boundaries of it are, and than I do in not liking it. So.